It seems it's cool to hate Dungeons and Dragons right now. Look, I get it. Wizards of the Coast has made plenty of mistakes. There was the OGL debacle. There was content bloat and rules overload with a lot of expansions. There were unbalanced adventures. And then there was this corporate chaos and firings and this overall perception of corporate greed. Dungeons and Dragons fans, we are legion. We are passionate. There are millions of us, right? And internet culture can be really vicious, especially where nerds are involved. And then we have Critical Role, the most popular D&D podcast out there right now, and they just announced season 4, in which they're going to be using the official 2024 5e rules for Dungeons and Dragons. That's huge news. So what's going on? Why all this criticism? Why does it seem cool to hate Dungeons and Dragons right now, or Wizards of the Coast specifically? Well, I have a few theories about that. Maybe it was Wizards of the Coast's mistakes. Maybe they were just too bad, or maybe there's something else going on. In this episode of Art of Character, I'm going to get into all of that. Hi, I'm Chris. Welcome to the Art of Character podcast, where we get into all things Dungeons and Dragons, focusing on the heart of the matter, the characters. In this episode, we are going to get into kind of why it's cool right now, at least on social media, to hate Dungeons and Dragons, or at least within a portion of the community. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Let's roll. So D&D is huge, and I'm going to get into some statistics right here. So Wizards of the Coast estimates that were about 85 million fans interacted with Dungeons and Dragons, the brand, overall in 2024. That's a lot of people. In 1981, they estimate there were about 3 million D&D players. In 2014, about 2 to 3 million players, so it came down a little bit. By 2017, there were about 12 to 15 million D&D players. What happened between 2014 and 2015? Well, in 2014, there was the release of the 5e rules, and Dungeons & Dragons started to become more and more popular. Wizards of the Coast estimates now that there are approximately 50 to 60 D&D players. That's a massive amount of D&D players. Like I said, we are legion. So then you talk about Dungeons & Dragons, the creator community. FeedSpot shows that there are about 1,064 YouTube channels, podcasts, journalists, and bloggers related to Dungeons and Dragons. And we know that there are several hundred active D&D channels on YouTube right now. When you get into actual views on that content, Critical Role gets about 188 million views last year alone. The next highest D&D channel was about 75 million views. That's a lot. And it's estimated that there's about a billion overall views per year for all D&D related content on YouTube. So there's a lot going on in the social community also. So what is the OGL? I want to talk about this just a little bit in case you don't know anything about it. I have a couple things here I'm going to read. First introduced in 2000 with D&D 3rd edition, it allowed creators to freely use and publish content compatible with Dungeons & Dragons. And they could use kind of this SRD, a shortened version of the rules completely freely as part of their content. There were some other rules around it, but essentially they could use a lot of the D&D IP and publish their own third-party content. A lot of people, started doing this. Several businesses cropped up, and people were making money off of their ventures related to Dungeons and Dragons. And D&D benefited also, Wizards of the Coast benefited also by all these third-party creators out there creating all this content, filling in some gaps and some voids, and really helped grow the overall D&D community. So what happened? Well, in 2023, late 2022, early 2023, there was this announcement of 1D&D. It was going to be an update to 5th edition, which originally launched in 2014. And Wizards of the Coast tried to roll out a new version of the OGL. They called it 1.1, and this sparked widespread internet backlash. This OGL 1.1 really tried to negate the OGL 1.0A, and what they said is that it would be no longer valid. And this is really pretty shocking because the OGL 1.0 was supposed to be a perpetual license, meaning that it goes on forever, that I can create this content as long as I follow these rules and I'm licensed to do that. It's fine. There aren't going to be any problems. Well, now they came up with all these other rules or possibilities that any third-party publisher making over a certain amount of money per year, then they had to pay some royalties to Dungeons and Dragons, and that anybody publishing this content and making money off of D&D would have to report their revenues to D&D. There were also some other rules thrown in there that looked like Wizards of the Coast would be able to use your third party content if they liked it enough later on down the road, and they weren't necessarily going to have to pay you royalties for that. At least that's what it looked like. Anyway, it cropped up just a huge amount of criticism online, and all these third party publishers got really angry. Um, so by January 2023, the OGL 1.1 was leaked. There was outrage. There was this open D&D campaign or kind of movement. Fans started canceling their D&D Beyond subscriptions. It was really kind of promoted online. Cancel D&D Beyond. This is ridiculous. We can't do this, right? So what happened? Well, competitors started seizing the moment. There are a bunch of sort of D&D third-party publishers that said, hey, we can push our versions and different versions of the rules that aren't really D&D and start pushing some of our products out there. Now's the time. People are angry at D&D, right? Paizo announced the ORC, which was Open RPG Creative License. And so under their version, you would be able to publish a lot of content, right? Anyway, so WotC or Wizard of the Coast started doing all these walkbacks. First response, they said, oh, there was just some misunderstandings. It's not really what we meant. And that made people even more angry. Then they announced draft 1.2. They removed some of the royalties, but claiming they could still revoke 1.0 in the future. Fans rejected that, or the creator community did and said, no, no good. WotC then put out a community survey and said, well, what do you want this thing to be, essentially, right? And there was this overwhelming response that really they were against rejecting OGL 1.0A. So then what eventually happened with all of this? Well, WotC came out, they basically reaffirmed 1.0A, so 2014 and any of the content previous, I guess, really to 2024 was still under the original OGL, and you could publish content like that. And then D&D 2024, 5e, and beyond would be under what is called the Creative Commons license. And so basically the older stuff and the newer stuff, technically, and it seems like now, even though they tried to revoke it, right, just not too long ago, it seems like now creators can continue to create content related to Dungeons & Dragons as long as you follow the rules and the outlines and the licensing agreements and the SRD. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of technical stuff for most of you, and hopefully I didn't lose you. But anyway, it's a lot of stuff that happened. And a lot of trust was sort of damaged in the D&D community, in the D&D creator community, and that is just something that went on, right? I've seen this before related to software, and what happens is companies try to change their licensing agreements from perpetual agreements and try to basically do a subscription. So you've got this recurring fee or something like that, and customers always get mad about it. But with D&D, it's different. It's not just software. It's not just a license. It's personal. It's our hobby. It's something we love, and D&D fans are really passionate. So we know that that's going on. Well, anyway, YouTube absolutely lit up with all this stuff. I'm quitting D&D. I'm moving over to this new system. And then all these new kind of alternate versions of Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop role-playing fantasy game genres started to crop up and get published. And, all these other sort of YouTubers were kind of pushing some of these things. It was coming up, right? Well, what's going on with a lot of those creators now? Well, actually, most of those D&D YouTube creators are still creating content about D&D. Most of their stuff is still about Dungeons and Dragons, but you do see other things that they're starting to create content for, like these other versions of tabletop role-playing games that are like D&D, but not D&D. But they're still doing D&D. They're still publishing about D&D. They're still talking about D&D and making videos about D&D. Well, we know that WotC backed down. And so essentially, this is, this should be a total win for the community. So why is there still kind of this backlash or this outrage? Like, what's really going on? Well, again, like I said, beyond the OGL, there were plenty of grievances. Endless expansions in books seemed like a money grab. The 2024 rules dropped race and alignment, and it was just too PC for some, right? The adventure book seemed incomplete or a waste of money. There was power creep. Really, when you talk about the challenge rating with monsters and when you're fighting in D&D, it seemed difficult to balance encounters, to balance adventures, and that characters were always getting more and more powerful, essentially becoming superheroes no matter what level they were at, and it became difficult for some DMs to balance combat. And it just seemed like, what's the point? We're just superheroes, right? Combat in 5e was also kind of clunky and difficult to get through. There were print quality issues with some of the books. And executives said the quiet part out loud. At one point, actually said that we believe Dungeons and Dragons is under monetized, and we're coming out with this subscription model, and it seemed like they were really going to try to squeeze the customers out of more money. So all of these were real frustrations added to the OGL or happened around the same time, right? So what else is going on here? One explanation could be outrage, internet outrage, cancel culture, negativity on the internet. We could call that a villain archetype, if you will. It feeds on fear and exaggeration and the mob mentality. And then what happens is you have all of this kind of going on, feeding on each other. One of the things they say in the media is if it bleeds, it leads, or negative content really can yield a lot of views, a lot of clickbait YouTube going on out there, even in the YouTube community. Click on this, D&D is failing, Wizards of the Coast is failing, oh my God, it's a disaster. And it gets views, it gets clicks, and people make money off of that. What else is going on? You feed off of the internet rage kind of that's out there, and some of these independent publishers or some of these YouTubers can then start to push some of their own content, right? Kind of feeding off of the rage in the background and everything that's going on. So I believe that's also part of what was going on. So another explanation would just be the addition problem. So edition changes in D&D rarely go smoothly. When we went from edition 3.5 to 4.0, there was such kind of outrage over that. It was just 4.0 was too far from 3.5. And so the company Paizo launched Pathfinder, right? Which is basically kind of their version of 3.5 and kind of expansion upon that. And there's a pretty robust community still following that. They never wanted to move on from 3.5. So with every change of an edition, you got your winners, your losers, your dropouts, and not everybody moves on from one edition to the next. And then there's a big internet rumor right now. Critical Role announces that they're going to use Dungeons and Dragons, but they just made this big switch for Campaign 4. They changed DMs, kind of, forever DM Matt Mercer is moving on to not be their permanent DM, but still obviously be a huge part of Critical Role. Then Brandon Lee Mulligan, a really popular DM also, is coming in to do their new campaign. So there's a lot going on there. Critical Role makes millions of dollars. They had almost 200 million views last year in their campaign. Hard to estimate exactly how much money they make, but it's in the millions. So what exactly happened here? The rumor is that money changed hands, and whether it was D&D saying, hey, we want you, the largest kind of D&D live play podcast, video podcast out there, we want you playing D&D, not Daggerheart. Here's some money, here's some sponsorship. Or maybe it was the other way. Maybe Daggerheart and Critical Role, they were getting so big that they said, hey, we know we're the biggest player out here. You want us to play D&D, this is what it's going to cost. Those are the rumors. Hard to say that's exactly what happened, but it seems like that's something that could have happened. Or maybe it's something like this. So Daggerheart is brand new, and it's getting more and more popular, but it is still not the most popular role-playing game out there. I mean, D&D is, 50 to 60 million players playing it. That's the estimate. That's a huge number of players. I don't care how many books they've sold for Daggerheart. It's nowhere near that. So if they're huge and they're making millions of dollars a year and they've been doing it with Dungeons and Dragons, then maybe just quite simply, hey, they don't kill the golden goose, as it were, right? They keep going with what's been making them all this money and keep going with Dungeons and Dragons and just kind of stay the course for now while building their Daggerheart content in the background, preparing for more launches in the future. And that's what they've said that they're going to do. So all these things are going on, and then yet the rage has still stuck around. So why is the rage sticking? Or maybe it just seemed to last, right? A little bit of gatekeeping versus mainstreaming, I think, is part of the thing that's going on. D&D went from about 3 million players or so right before the 2024 launch of 5e. Just a few years later, it was around 12 to 15 million players, this huge jump in popularity. And then since I could say probably Stranger Things. A lot of people really got interested in D&D during Stranger Things. There was a huge bump during the pandemic. All of a sudden, Dungeons and Dragons became really popular to play, right? And it was out in the open. It was no longer uncool. And so you have all these nerds that have been sitting around in the background, geeks just like me. And back in the day, I was one of them. I was a part of this. It was not cool to play Dungeons and Dragons. You would actively get bullied or threatened for playing Dungeons and Dragons. It actively happened to me, right? And so it just wasn't the cool thing. Then all of a sudden, you have these people who were interested in playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it's the popular thing to do now. So it happens with a lot of kind of niche hobbies, right? Where you've got gatekeeping. All of a sudden, there's all these new people coming in. This is my hobby. I was an OG. I was here first. I'm not interested in doing it now that it's popular. I'm going to move over here off to this other niche hobby, this other fantasy TTRPG, that's like D&D but not D&D. And then there's the money factor. When you really get down to it, whenever there's something that happens and it's related to business and you don't really know why it happened, one of the reasons I think is always money. When you analyze it, it's money. And a lot of these creators that are out there creating their alternate versions to Dungeons and Dragons, quite simply, they can just make more money by playing D&D. They can just make more money now while they're still building their other content and kind of capitalizing on the rage and capitalizing on this wave a little bit. They can still make more money by continuing down this path of talking about Dungeons and Dragons and playing Dungeons and Dragons. In my table, we still play mostly 2014 5e. When 2024 rules came out, it was right about the time I was starting some new campaigns as a DM. Asked the players, they didn't really care, said, hey, we don't really want to spend all the time to learn all these new rules right now. Let's keep playing 2014, and we'll do a little homebrew and add some of the interesting things about the 2024 rules in and really kind of continue to play our version of the game, kind of like we've always done. And like many groups, you blend a little bit of what's old and what's new and what works and what doesn't work for you. And quite frankly, for a lot of groups, this 2024 change may have hit at exactly the right time. Fresh off of the OGL scandal, some of the issues that people had with the rules, and then you just throw in a new edition where not everybody's going to move on. And then you have all these creators who have been making all this money, who were most recently threatened by the possible change in the licensing, who then have motivation to go off and kind of start pushing some of their own versions or rules or books or all of that. And so there really hasn't been a universal change over to the 2024 rules yet, but that always kind of happens with D&D. So a bit of a reality check. The broader D&D community absolutely did not follow the outrage. D&D is still the most popular of the role-playing games out there. At least it was at Gen Con. There are about 1,200 Dungeons and Dragons tables, and there really weren't any other competitors that were really even close to that. There are still millions of players playing it, and there is still a huge community out there. Most of the players that I know aren't really aware of the OGL, and we'll get into that here in just a minute. So I think part of the issue, too, is that there's a bit of an internet bubble going on. You've got some very vocal social media creators on YouTube and in podcasts out there talking about all these issues with D&D. But this isn't all of D&D by far. So this is a bubble. Only the people who are engaging in this community, who are a part of this community, those are the only ones who are hearing about it and seeing about it. So why do I say this? It's my experience. Since I started playing again most heavily in 2020, most of my tables have been absolutely unaware of all of this drama with Dungeons and Dragons. A new edition, well, their question is just which one are we playing? The OGL debacle, they're like, oh, well, does that affect us? Well, I'm going to show up to the next game. Are we going to keep playing? They're just interested in playing. And the game they know is Dungeons & Dragons. The game they're interested in playing is Dungeons & Dragons. And all of this other stuff, it seems like maybe they really don't care about as much as this kind of small portion, which is this really passionate Dungeons & Dragons online community. So at all the tables that I've been a part of, less than 20% of the players were even aware of all of these issues going on. And those that were aware, most of them didn't really care. The ones who had been around for 20 or 30 years as DMs or players, some of them cared a little bit more. Maybe they cared in that they didn't really like 5th edition and kind of the power creep and how all players were superheroes and all of these rules. And they really kind of liked the OSR, the old school Renaissance, looking back to some of the older editions and rules. There's that kind of thing, and that's kind of always been going on. But most of the players that I've been aware of, and I have DM'd in over 6 campaigns, I've played in over 7 campaigns, I've played with 4 different DMs, I've played at conventions. Look, for the most part, the average D&D player is just not interested in all of this stuff that's going on and all of this drama. They just want to play their game, and most of them are interested in Dungeons and Dragons. And look, let's talk about Critical Role for a minute. I've watched and listened to episodes of Critical Role. The only season I've watched all the way through was one of their early seasons before they were even their own channel. I think they were on Geek and Sundry at the time. And this was like a 12 episode season, right? Kind of an offshoot, really, not even the main Critical Role. Since then, I've watched a few episodes, but I really don't have 3 or 4 hours to sit down and watch an episode all the way through. I check in and see some of the points of the story that are going on and generally follow some of the stuff that's going on. But most of the people that I play with, actually, a lot of them are not even fully aware of Critical Role. I would say the majority, over half, aren't even aware of Critical Role, believe it or not. Almost all of them are aware of Stranger Things. I would say just about everybody's aware of Stranger Things I play with. And a lot of that kind of spurred some of the interest. 2020 kind of spurred a lot of this new interest. But even Critical Role, the most popular live play podcast out there, I've still got a majority of the people I've played with haven't watched a ton of it. And believe it or not, a lot of them, the greater majority, also haven't watched through all of Vox Machina. I watched all of it. Fantastic. I love it, right? And several of the players I play with are also into it also. But not all of them, not everyone. This whole experience of all this internet culture and all the stuff that's going on is just not universal for all of Dungeons and Dragons. So how does a lot of this YouTube content work for most of the people that I play with? Well, most of the people I play with are DM for. They have jobs, they have families, they have kids, they go to school, they have other hobbies, other interests. They are paying bills. And so how YouTube is used mostly is most of the people I know do not subscribe to YouTubers and then just watch all of their content and are just, kind of these avid consumers of internet D&D culture. It's quite the opposite. What most of the people who I know who play D&D, the average kind of player, how they use it is they're starting a new character, they're starting a new campaign, there's a new version of the rules. They click on some videos, and how they get to those videos is they do a Google search, and doing that Google search, they read a few articles, and right now one of the things people are doing also pretty heavily is ChatGPT. Hey ChatGPT, tell me how this works. Tell me about this spell versus that spell. What are the best spells to pick for a first level wizard? All of those kind of things are the searches that people are doing. And then they come across some YouTube videos, they discover some things they're interested in, and that is how most of my players and the people I know are familiar with D&D, that's how they kind of research characters, research what they're going to do, research what the rules, figure it out, and that's how they're using internet culture. And let's face it, D&D is still absolutely massive, the largest TTRPG out there. It's still really popular. In fact, it's so popular that you don't really get bullied for playing D&D anymore. It's okay. In fact, it's cool in a lot of circles to play D&D. I mention it to people now, and I have I shouldn't say I have I still sometimes have a little bit of reluctance. I was bullied. I'm a Gen Xer. We were bullied for playing D&D back in the 80s and the 90s for sure. So, there's still a little bit of that trauma, I guess. It's still in there somewhere. But more and more and more, I can more openly say that and not really worry about the response. People are more so curious or interested. And especially as more and more people play it, there's more and more curiosity and interest in playing D&D. All right, so my final take, what happened? WotC made a bunch of mistakes, a bunch of missteps, and there were a bunch of creators, these third-party creators that were out there, they were outraged, their livelihood was threatened. I get it. If someone threatens my job or my income, right, it's probably going to trigger some fear in me. That happened, but then a lot of these creators that had other projects or ideas about alternate rules or systems they wanted to publish, they seized upon the moment, right, and sort of capitalized on this outrage, this internet culture, and that is a lot of what I think has happened. But a lot of these systems are still brand new. They're still gaining a foothold, and the largest player in the community, as I've said over and over, is still Dungeons and Dragons. The largest number of players still wants to play D&D. So what I think has happened is a lot of these creators and personalities that see out there, they haven't necessarily retreated, but they're sticking with their bread and butter. They're sticking with what they know works while they're still trying to build their other sources of income. So what's going to happen? I mean, D&D is going to continue, and it's going to continue to evolve, and D&D will survive. I don't think, some of these upstarts are really going to overtake it. That's really an exaggeration. I just don't think it's going to happen. 50 to 60 million players, that's a huge number. And I mean, D&D survived 4E, which was basically, called the worst edition of Dungeons and Dragons ever. The other thing that's going to happen is all these third-party creators now with kind of, the new licensing agreement, they're going to continue to create content for Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of these content creators also will continue evolving and creating their own systems, their own books, their own publications for alternate systems to D&D. What they're going to try to do is they're going to try to grow those. They're going to try to increase their market share. That's what you do as a business, right? And at a certain point, I guess when they feel that they have grown their smaller business to the degree that it can overtake whatever business they have with actual D&D, then some of those are going to start making the move over there and devoting all the resources to it. That's what you do as a business owner. And so I guess a final word about this internet outrage, right? So I think internet outrage, cancel culture, and all of that, right? Clickbaiting, rage baiting, all of that. I think that's the villain, and I loathe all of that stuff. And look, I'm not calling all of these D&D creators, YouTubers, I'm not calling these folks villains. Far from it, right? They were my inspiration to start my own channel. I love a lot of the content that they create. I just really hate all of the negativity. It's just really, I don't know, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way. I get it. When you have something that's legitimate to talk about and complain about, a bone to pick, an issue, go ahead and talk about it. We have freedom of speech here in this country. Please do it by all means. But I think there's something else that we can do that's a little bit better. And by far, this is not the end of the story. You see, because there are still heroes, right? We have villains, you have heroes. And the heroes are you and me and the entire D&D community. And I think positivity ultimately wins. So the DMs and the players that are out there that still want D&D to survive and to continue on, those are the heroes, right? We are still trying to play this game, and ultimately what we're playing is our version of the game, because this is a little bit about hacker culture and DIY culture and creating the adventure and the character that you want. That's always been part of the D&D ethos, and it's not going to stop now. We're going to continue to do this thing. We're going to continue to play the games that we like. People and players are going to continue to do the things that they have fun doing with Dungeons & Dragons, and it will live on. I still love D&D. My players still love D&D. They still want to play it. I still want to run it, so we're going to keep doing that. And I know it can be cool to hate what's popular at times. It can be cool to hate Dungeons & Dragons, or at least it was for a while. But D&D is still massive. It's still huge, and it's still hugely popular, and I hope that it continues to carry on and live on, as I think it will. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Art of Character podcast, where we publish new Dungeons and Dragons related content each and every week. If you want to support the channel, you can like, comment, or subscribe, or click below and you can join our Patreon, or click below and you can purchase something from our merch store, like this really cool t-shirt just like this. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us.